Good morning. This is Jill Epstein, Executive Director of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. It is Friday, March 20th, 2015, and I thank you for watching this webinar on the proposed chapter affiliation agreement. The outline for today's presentation will be, we'll start with the history of the chapter agreement. We will then go to review the proposed chapter agreement. We'll talk about the importance of a signed chapter agreement and then move on to our next steps. I want you to be aware that you can view the actual marked up version of the chapter agreement in the CAMFT community within the chapter leadership group library. And that version that you'll see in the library reflects comments from the last comment period and all the details about the changes that were made. So first with the history, to date CAMFT has operated by simply sending chapters a charter, which was just a certificate signed by the chapter president that demonstrated that the chapter met all the formation requirements. A policy on chapters of CAMFT was written in 1993 and updated in 2010. Most of the provisions in the proposed chapter agreement are taken directly from the long-standing policy on chapters. The CAMFT bylaws also provide for some terms regarding chapters, and those are incorporated into the proposed chapter agreement. The signed chapter agreement has been under discussion in open session at the board level beginning in September 2012. In June 2013, I hosted a webinar about the proposed terms for the agreement, and we archived that, and member comments were solicited for 90 days. In December of 2013, member comments were incorporated into language for the proposed chapter agreement. In March 2014, the board directed staff again to put the proposed language out to chapter leaders for an additional comment period, since some chapters had indicated that the full participation in the initial comment period may have been overshadowed by concerns about the bylaws. In September 2014, those member comments were incorporated into language for an updated proposed chapter agreement. The board didn't have time to address that issue at the meeting in September. So in December 2014, the board reviewed the updated proposed chapter agreement, which included comments and suggestions from chapters and chapter leaders, and directed staff to present the version of that updated chapter agreement along with the current policies that affect chapters to leaders at the CLC, the Chapter Leader Conference, and via this webinar. In December 2014, the board also approved a motion to provide a $500 stipend to chapters who prevent proof of commercial general liability insurance with CAMFT as an additional insured. This is apart from the chapter affiliation agreement and will be offered each year until January 2018. In April 2015, the newest proposed chapter agreement will be open for a final comment period until April 30th, and the board will be reviewing the comments and the final agreement at the June 2015 board meeting. So now I'm going to review the actual language of the proposed chapter affiliation agreement. I'll be reviewing each of the 23 sections of the agreement. What I hope you will recognize through this is that virtually all of the language is taken from the long-standing CAMFT policies that direct chapter activity. Section 1, Formation and Rights of Chapters. Chapters shall be formed in accordance with the provisions of the CAMFT bylaws and other policies pertaining to chapters. So long as chapters are in good standing, which includes but is not necessarily limited to full compliance with this agreement, its own bylaws, the CAMFT bylaws, the CAMFT Code of Ethics, and all other policies and procedures of CAMFT, chapters shall have the right to utilize the name of CAMFT in the name of the chapters, to represent itself as affiliated with CAMFT, and to receive all other benefits bestowed by CAMFT upon its affiliated chapters. The language reflects items 1 and 2 from the policy on chapters created in 1993 and updated in 2010, and reflects language from the bylaws Article 22, which references. This section now captures the right of a chapter to utilize the CAMFT name, to represent itself as affiliated with CAMFT, and to receive other benefits from CAMFT. The use of the logo is currently in a separate use of CAMFT logo policy created in 1989, and the use of the CAMFT name is in a separate use of the CAMFT name policy created in 1993. The CAMFT board should provide opportunity for chapters to give input on future policies that affect chapters, since chapters have always been bound to follow such policies that are related to chapters. There was some concern raised about chapters being held to future policies. However, as I indicate, that's always existed, and I would strongly suggest that any board that is considering making policy changes that affect chapters would solicit chapter suggestions before those chapters are finalized, before those policies are finalized. And finally, other benefits in addition to using the benefit of the CAMFT name are access to CAMFT member lists, access to legal assistance with chapter governance issues, and CAMFT's professional reputation. Relationship. CAMFT and CAMFT chapters are separate legal entities. Chapters are not and shall not be considered a partner, joint venture, subsidiary, legal representative, or agent of CAMFT. At no time shall chapters act or represent themselves to be acting in any of these capacities. Neither CAMFT nor chapter shall have the right or power to bind or obligate the other party in any manner, and shall not make or represent that it has the power to make any contract, agreement, representation, warranty, or obligation, express or implied, on behalf of the other party. Neither CAMFT nor chapter shall be liable for any act, error, omission, debt, or other liability or obligation of the other. This section reflects language from CAMFT Bylaws Article 22. This section benefits both parties by making it clear that the parties are separate legal entities and are not responsible for the acts or omissions of the other party. Section 3, Bylaws. Chapters shall abide by and promote the purposes and objectives of CAMFT as set forth in the most current version of CAMFT Bylaws. Chapters shall also adopt and abide by its own bylaws, which shall be consistent with CAMFT's bylaws. Chapter shall submit its bylaws and all proposed bylaw amendments to CAMFT for approval to ensure compliance with this paragraph. This language reflects Item 1 from the Policy on Chapters, which was created in 1993 and updated in 2010. This codifies that chapters shall promote the purposes and objectives of CAMFT as set forth in the CAMFT bylaws. At the request of the chapters, we had removed language that required the bylaws to be in a form acceptable to CAMFT. However, chapters must submit bylaws and proposed bylaw amendments to CAMFT for approval to ensure compliance, which is common practice in affiliation agreements. It is also, as an aside, useful for CAMFT staff to have access to the current bylaws so that we can easily access them for questions about legal and governance issues that chapters may pose to our legal team. Number 4, membership. Clinical, pre-licensed, and associate CAMFT members in good standing, as defined by the CAMFT bylaws, shall be eligible for membership in chapters of CAMFT. Chapters may establish other categories of membership as they deem appropriate, and those individuals do not need to be members of CAMFT, so long as individuals or entities accepted for such memberships do not otherwise qualify as clinical, pre-licensed, or associate members of CAMFT. Loss of membership in CAMFT as a clinical, pre-licensed, or associate member shall result in loss of membership in chapters. These limitations are from Item 3 from the Policy on Chapters created in 1993 and updated in 2010. Item 5, dues. The following language was deleted from the current proposed chapter agreement after chapters felt that this would be stating the obvious. Chapters may establish and require chapter fees, dues, and assessments on its members. Section 6, Board Composition. The composition of the chapter's Board of Directors shall not be inconsistent with the CAMFT bylaws. In case of necessity, a chapter may request a variance from the CAMFT Board of Directors if the above provision is not achievable. Such request is granted solely for a one-year period. The chapter may make a separate request to the CAMFT Board of Directors should the necessity arise for a variance in any subsequent year. The language from the CAMFT Bylaws, Article 22, clearly states that the chapter board shall be comprised of no more than 35% associate or pre-licensed members of CAMFT, and such members shall not serve as president, president-elect, or past president. There is no wiggle room in the bylaws to allow for chapters to have different compositions to reflect their community and membership besides this request for a variance each year. Item 7, Annual Report. Chapters are required to submit to CAMFT an annual report on the membership and financial status of the chapters within 30 days after the new chapter board is seated. Specifically, the annual chapter report shall include, but not be limited to, letter A, a listing of outgoing and newly elected chapter officers and committee chairs. This is Item 6 from the Policy on Chapters created in 1993 and updated in 2010. We use this information to populate the chapter leadership listserv, which is the primary way for CAMFT to communicate with chapter leaders and for chapter leaders to communicate with each other. Letter B was deleted at the request of the chapters. A summary of the past year's activities, including number of regular and special meetings, topics, and any special events such as seminars and trade events. While this would have been helpful so CAMFT could understand the local member experience and the level of activity of each chapter, it was deemed not to be necessary. Letter C, a roster of current members, both voting and non-voting as applicable. The chapter's mailing list, including at a minimum the full name, mailing address, and email address for each chapter member. License number is also helpful. This is Item number 5 from the Policy on Chapters created in 1993 and updated in 2010. though it removed a requirement from previous versions of chapter agreement, which would have asked for the information for all attendees of these events. And it was brought to our attention that you have attendees of your events who are non-members, which that information is not relevant or appropriate for CAMFT to collect. So the provision was narrowed to just the members who are the roster of current members. The data helps CAMFT identify which CAMFT members belong to chapters and confirms that the chapter is complying with the membership limitations listed earlier from the policy on chapters created in 1993 and updated in 2010. Letter D, a balance sheet showing the current assets and liabilities of the chapter or a copy of the annual financial report prepared in accordance with the chapter bylaws. This is new and simply requests that chapters share with CAMFT what is required by the Corporations Code for chapters to make available to members. CAMFT provides an annual report to its members, and chapters should be as transparent with CAMFT as a condition to using the CAMFT name. I will also note that we added the word "or" a copy of the annual financial report so that chapters have the choice whether to provide a balance sheet or whether they choose to provide an annual report. Number 8, taxes. This language was deleted at the request of chapters because it states the obvious. Chapters shall establish and maintain their own bank accounts. The language that was retained, however, says chapters shall obtain their own federal employer identification number for use in opening chapters accounts. Chapters shall obtain their own tax-exempt status or pay taxes as appropriate for their organizational structure. While this has never been formally required in CAMFT policy, any business entity needs to comply with these IRS and state requirements. This section benefits both parties as it documents and supports that they are separate entities. Number 9, CAMFT name and logo use. The distinction between chapters and CAMFT must be maintained. Communication by a chapter and its officers or members in correspondence, reports, or other materials must always identify the chapter by name. The use of CAMFT's name and logo and the CAMFT acronym by the chapter must always include the name of the chapter, not just the CAMFT name, so as not to confuse communications from CAMFT with those of chapters, especially when communicating with the general public. This captured the terms of the existing use of name policy from 1993 and the use of logo policy from 1987. CAMFT's name and logo are amongst CAMFT's most valuable assets, and their use must be actively protected. Number 10, membership list use. A chapter may request and receive at no charge up to 4 mailing lists or labels per year comprised of members in good standing of CAMFT located within the region represented by the chapter. The mailing labels and lists may only be used for official chapter activities, i.e. publicized chapter events, assist chapter with chapter membership drives, etc., and may not be sold. They also may not be distributed or shared with individuals inside or outside of the chapter. A chapter that does not comply with this policy may lose the privilege of receiving future mailing labels or lists. Any chapter that wishes to request mailing labels or lists from CAMFT should complete the chapter mailing label list request form. This is language from the policy on chapter use of CAMFT mailing labels and lists from 2007. The member list is an incredibly valuable asset of any organization. The membership list must be protected and its use limited so as to preserve the value and to assure CAMFT members who are not chapter members that the information is not being used for another purpose. Number 11, member suspension or expulsion. CAMFT agrees to notify chapter within 15 days in the event that any chapter member is suspended or expelled from membership in CAMFT. In such cases, chapter shall notify the member that his or her membership in the chapter is also suspended or terminated. This is a notice section and it benefits chapters only. It ensures that a member suspended or terminated by CAMFT understands that his or her membership in the chapter is also likely suspended or terminated. Number 12, indemnification and defense. Chapters in CAMFT agree to mutually indemnify, defend, and hold each other harmless from any and all claims, loss, liabilities, damages, costs, including attorney's fees and costs, that CAMFT, chapter, or any of CAMFT or chapter's past, present, or future officers, directors, or employees incurs as a result of the acts or omissions of the other or the breach of this agreement by either. This language reflects CAMFT Bylaws Article 22. The language was changed at the chapter's request to make the indemnification mutual. Number 13, insurance. Chapter shall obtain and maintain at its own expense a broad form commercial general liability insurance policy providing coverage of at least $1 million per occurrence and a $2 million aggregate. Chapters shall obtain a director's and officer's liability policy of at least $100,000 per occurrence for any act or omission committed by chapter or its officers, directors, employees, or volunteers during the term of this agreement, which causes harm, liability, or damages to CAMFT or CAMFT's officers, directors, employees, volunteers, or invitees. Chapters shall name CAMFT as an additional insured on the CGL and D&O policy. Chapters shall provide CAMFT with written proof of insurance at any time requested by CAMFT, but no less than once a year. Commercial liability first protects the chapters from damages claimed by a third party who is injured at a chapter or event or who has an advertising, slander, or libel claim against the chapter. Insurers will likely review your total number of members and your total number of events. This type of coverage would likely average $500 per chapter. The board voted in December 2014 to offer an annual $500 stipend each year through January 2018, independent from this agreement, to chapters who provide proof of commercial liability insurance naming CAMFT as an additional insured. This offer is in effect now, independent of this agreement, and I will note that several chapters have already been issued their stipend checks. Number 14, continuing education. This language was deleted from the proposed agreement at the chapter's request. If chapter serves as a continuing education provider, the chapter must be a provider in good standing with a relevant approval agency. We'd originally asked for this provision because a chapter in the past had failed to renew their PCE number with the BBS, and as a result, the courses that some of our members were taking were not going to be valid. However, we understand that this was a request of the chapters that this not be included in the agreement, since the chapters are on their own understanding that they must be a provider in good standing. Number 15, CAMFT member number. This language was also deleted from the proposed agreement at the chapter's request. Chapters shall request CAMFT member number on the chapter member application. While this would help chapters ensure that they are accepting appropriate clinical, associate, or pre-licensed members, CAMFT should not require that the license number is collected. Chapters, however, do need to determine if the applicant is a member of CAMFT by some mechanism. Number 16, suspension or termination. Chapter's charter and this agreement shall terminate automatically upon the dissolution of CAMFT for any reason. The chapter must cease using the CAMFT name, logo, and mailing list of CAMFT members immediately upon dissolution of CAMFT. A chapter may be suspended and its charter terminated by a majority vote of the CAMFT Board of Directors if the chapter has breached its agreement or if the board believes that the chapter has engaged or is engaging in activities which are not in the best interest of CAMFT. This language is from the Bylaws, Article 22. It is a new provision, though, however, that allows the board to propose suspension as an alternative to revocation. I will note also that if CAMFT dissolves, the CAMFT chapter cease to exist. A chapter could potentially file for a name change and change bylaws and policy so as not to reflect CAMFT, so therefore a chapter could stay in business in another way. We therefore remove some stricter language from an earlier proposal that would have required the chapter to cease business. In the event the CAMFT board determines that suspension or termination of a chapter is necessary, the following procedure shall be followed. Letter A, the chapter shall be given 60 days prior to written notice of the proposed suspension or termination and the reasons for the proposed suspension or termination. Any notice of proposed suspension or termination shall be either personally hand-delivered or sent by overnight express mail service to the chapter's last address as shown on the CAMFT records, as well as to the president of the chapters if that person's address is different than the chapter's address. This is item 7 from the policy on chapters created in 1993 and updated in 2010. The only new language prescribes the notice delivery, which was absent in the old policy. Letter B, the chapter shall be given an opportunity to be heard, either orally or in writing, at least 5 days before the effective date of the proposed suspension or termination. The hearing shall be held or the written statement considered by the CAMFT board to determine whether suspension or termination should take place. This reflects item 7 from the policy on chapters created in 1993 and updated in 2010. The original item provided for a hearing but only referenced revocation and required the board to take action at the next regularly scheduled board meeting following the chapter's response and/or hearing. The proposed agreement does not include those limitations. Letter C, the CAMFT board shall decide by a majority vote whether or not the chapter should be suspended, terminated, or sanctioned in some way. The decision of the CAMFT board shall be final. This is from Bylaws, Article 22. Letter D, any court action challenging the suspension or termination of a chapter by the CAMFT board, including a claim of alleging defective notice, must be commenced within 1 year after the effective date of the suspension or termination. This is a new provision, and a 1-year statute of limitations is very standard. Upon suspension or termination of a chapter's charter, the chapter shall cease utilizing CAMFT's name, acronym, mailing list, and logo, all of which are owned completely and exclusively by CAMFT, and may no longer claim any affiliation with CAMFT. This states the obvious ramification of a suspension or termination of a chapter. Number 17, inspection of records. Chapters agree that they will make their records available for inspection by CAMFT during the term of this agreement and for up to 3 years after any termination of this agreement. CAMFT will give chapter a reasonable amount of time to respond to any request for records, keeping in mind that chapter board members are volunteers and that records may not be stored in one central location. The custodian of such chapter records shall provide access within the chapter's geographic area. And I want to add here that the chapters had wanted this clarified that CAMFT would be required to come to the chapter's geographic area to inspect records, as opposed to requiring that the records be sent to CAMFT. This is likely used only and unless there's a problem with the chapter. It avoids litigation to obtain records if there is a dispute, and it is a new provision. Number 18, Ethics Committee. Chapters may, but are not required to, create an ethics committee to advise the chapter's board and membership regarding CAMFT's code of ethics and procedures. However, no chapter may establish its own code of ethics or make determinations regarding ethics-related cases. All such cases are subject to the CAMFT code of ethics and procedures for handling such matters. Any ethics committee created by chapters is advisory only. This is a new provision, and it clarifies the distinction and role of a chapter ethics committee versus the CAMFT ethics committee, which is the only one that operates under the authority of the code of ethics. Provisions 19 to 23 are boilerplate legalese. They cover attorney's fees and venue, which was adjusted per the chapter's request to allow the suit to be filed anywhere in California, not only in San Diego as originally written. It refers to being the sole and only agreement, that this agreement supersedes any and all other agreements. It covers severability. If any provision is found by a court to be invalid or void, the remaining provisions shall continue in full force and effect. It covers assignment and amendment. Neither party may assign or transfer or change or modify the agreement without written consent of the other party. And it covers governing law, that this agreement is pursuant to the laws of the state of California. So the importance of a chapter agreement is as follows. First is that it's a written signed document that makes it clear that the chapter is allowed to use CAMFT's name. It benefits chapters and CAMFT to have their separate legal status clearly stated in a written signed agreement. In the event that either a chapter or CAMFT is sued, the group that is not being sued can argue that its assets are not subject to the suit because they are separate entities. It is a benefit to chapters and CAMFT to have attorney's fees clause, because if there ever is a dispute between CAMFT and the chapter, the only way the prevailing party can recover attorney fees is if that provision is in a written agreement. It's a benefit to the chapters to have the process for termination specifically set forth in a signed document. This prevents CAMFT from arbitrarily deciding to terminate a chapter. Chapter must be given due process, and the agreement specifies what the due process entails. The existing CAMFT chapter relationship has worked effectively and cooperatively for 50 years. However, the CAMFT board and your chapter board have a duty to avoid the inherent risk associated with an affiliation that does not adequately document the expectations of each party and bind the party to these conditions. So the next steps on this road to a proposed chapter agreement is to collect final feedback on the new proposed chapter affiliation agreement through April 30th, 2015. Chapter comments and suggestions should be sent to me, jepstein@camft.org. The board will consider comments and suggestions at the June 2015 board meeting, and will send out the results of that board meeting to chapter leaders shortly thereafter. I thank you so much for your attention, and if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me at any time. Thank you very much, and have a great day.